So there I was, standing in the most pretentious classroom in the known galaxy, wondering how exactly I'd ended up surrounded by what looked like a rejected Star Wars cantina scene. Welcome to the Galactic Survival Academy, where apparently every species in the universe comes to prove they're tough enough to not die horribly on uninhabitable rocks floating through space. The academy itself was your typical overcompensating alien architecture. Think crystal spires meeting brutalist concrete, with just enough glowing nonsense to make you squint. They'd built it on some neutral moon that smelled perpetually like disinfectant and disappointment. Perfect place to train the galaxy's future survival experts, assuming any of us actually survived the training. My name's Jake Morrison, by the way. Human, Earth. You know, that little blue planet everyone keeps calling a death world? Because apparently having weather and wild animals makes us the galaxy's equivalent of extreme sports enthusiasts? I was here on some cultural exchange program that sounded way better on paper than it did in practice. Attention, candidates, Professor Vextel clicked from the front of the room. And yes, I mean clicked. Imagine a praying mantis had a baby with a filing cabinet, gave it a PhD in being insufferably pedantic, and dressed it in academic robes. That's Vextel. Today marks your final examination. The room went dead quiet, except for the nervous gurgling from Zara, this aquatic species who'd spent the entire semester looking like she was perpetually drowning in anxiety. Her gill slits kept fluttering whenever anyone mentioned the final exam. Next to her sat Brick, and if you're wondering if that's his real name or just what I called him because he looked like a walking pile of rocks with delusions of grandeur, well, you'd be right on both counts. For the next 30 standard days, Vextal continued, his compound eyes scanning the room like he was already picking out which of us would make the best cautionary tale, you will be placed alone on Keth 7, a Class 5 hostile environment. No communication devices, no rescue beacons, no outside assistance of any kind. Brick rumbled something that sounded like confidence, but looked like stupidity. Finally, a real challenge. My homeworld has 3 times the gravity, and acid rain every day. I couldn't help myself. Wow, sounds like paradise. No wonder you're so cheerful all the time. The glare Brick gave me could have melted steel, which honestly might have been one of his actual abilities. Hard to tell with rock people. Vextal's mandibles clicked in. What I'd learned was his version of clearing his throat. As I was saying, Keth 7 presents numerous survival challenges. Predatory fauna, unstable weather patterns, limited freshwater sources, and terrain that has claimed the lives of over 60% of previous test subjects. Previous test subjects, I muttered under my breath. Not previous students, test subjects. That's not ominous at all. Zara's gills were practically hyperventilating now. 60% fatality rate? How is this legal? It's not, Vextal replied cheerfully. That's why we make you sign 17 different waivers and technically classify this as voluntary assisted natural selection rather than education. The whole room started shifting uncomfortably, except for me. I was doing mental math. 60% fatality rate meant 40% success rate, which honestly sounded pretty good for government work. Plus, I'd been camping since I was 5. My dad owned Morrison Construction, and Mom was one of those outdoor enthusiast types who thought a relaxing weekend meant backpacking 20 miles through bear country. The examination is simple, Vextal continued. Survive. The planet will try to kill you in approximately 47 different ways according to our latest count. Your task is to not let it succeed. Any questions? Brick raised a massive stone fist. What constitutes failure? Death, mostly, Vextal replied with academic precision, though we'll also accept permanent psychological trauma, complete physical incapacitation, or transformation into something that's technically no longer your original species. And success? Squeaked Zara. Still being recognizably alive and mentally coherent after 30 days. The bar is refreshingly low. I raised my hand. What about thriving? The professor's compound eyes focused on me with the intensity of someone trying to figure out if they were looking at profound stupidity or dangerous confidence. I'm sorry, what did you say? Thriving. You know, not just surviving but actually improving your situation, building something better than what you started with, making the place work for you instead of against you. The entire class turned to stare at me like I'd just suggested we hold hands and sing Kumbaya with the predatory fauna. Vextal's mandibles clicked rapidly. Mr. Morrison, this is a survival examination, not a vacation planning seminar. Right, but theoretically speaking, if someone did more than just survive, that wouldn't count against them, would it? I suppose not. though the question is largely academic since the primary challenge will be not dying horribly. I grinned. Good to know. As the other students filed out, muttering prayers to their respective deities and updating their last wills and testaments, I started making my own mental notes. Hostile environment, limited resources, 30 days, no outside help. Honestly, it sounded like the camping trips Dad used to take me on, except with less chance of running into park rangers. This was going to be fun. 24 hours later, I was strapped into what the Academy generously called a landing pod, but what I'd describe as a garbage can with delusions of being spacecraft. The whole thing shook like a paint mixer as we descended through HFY's atmosphere, which was apparently designed by someone who thought regular weather was for wimps. "Attention test subjects," crackled Vextal's voice through the intercom. "You are now approaching your designated drop zones. Remember, communication devices have been disabled. Emergency beacons will only activate in case of imminent death, and the planet's natural electromagnetic field will prevent any off-world contact for the duration of your examination." Through the tiny porthole, I caught my first glimpse of Keth 7. It looked like someone had taken Earth, cranked up the saturation to 11, and then let a committee of sadistic landscape architects redesign the whole thing. Purple trees that definitely weren't trees, rivers that glowed the wrong color, and mountains that moved just enough to make you question your sanity. "Good luck," Vextal added, which sounded about as sincere as a politician's campaign promise. The pod hit the ground with all the grace of a drunk elephant, bounced twice, and came to rest at a 45-degree angle against what I really hoped was a rock and not some sleeping megafauna. I popped the hatch, grabbed my basic survival kit, which consisted of a knife, a water purification tablet, and what appeared to be emergency rations that had been designed by someone who'd never actually eaten food, and stepped out into my new, temporary home. First impression, it didn't immediately try to kill me, which put it ahead of several camping trips I'd been on. Second impression, this place was actually kind of beautiful, in a one wrong step and your fertilizer sort of way. The air was breathable, which was a pleasant surprise since nobody had bothered to mention that detail during the briefing. It smelled like ozone and something floral that probably meant deadly pollen in the local ecosystem's vocabulary. The gravity felt about Earth normal, maybe slightly lighter, which meant I could still walk without looking like I was doing an interpretive dance about joint pain. I spent the first hour doing what any sensible person would do, not panicking. While my survival instincts kicked in, my construction background started cataloging everything I was seeing. The purple trees weren't trees at all. They were some kind of hollow coral structure that grew in perfect geometric patterns. The glowing river wasn't radioactive. It was full of bioluminescent organisms that seemed to pulse in response to vibrations. And those moving mountains? Definitely not mountains. Probably better not to think too hard about what they actually were. Day 1 was reconnaissance. I marked potential water sources, identified which plants looked edible versus which ones looked like they were actively plotting my demise, and found a defensible position near what turned out to be natural hot springs. Because apparently even hostile alien planets couldn't resist including luxury amenities. By day 2, I'd confirmed that the local wildlife operated on a fairly predictable schedule. The big scary predators hunted at night, the medium scary predators hunted at dawn and dusk, and the small scary predators were mostly just annoying rather than lethal. It was like a nature documentary, except the narrator kept trying to eat the camera crew. The really interesting discovery came on day 3, when I realized I could hear the other students. Not directly, of course, but sound travels funny in Keth 7's atmosphere, and when Brick started roaring about something that was probably trying to eat him, the echoes bounced around the canyon systems for miles. Zara's distress calls carried even further, probably because her species had evolved some kind of natural sonar that worked way too well for maintaining exam protocol. I could have helped them. The Academy probably expected me to help them in that whole learning the value of cooperation way that educational institutions love so much. Instead, I started sketching blueprints. See, here's the thing about humans that other species never quite understand. We don't just survive hostile environments. We renovate them. We look at a death world and think, you know what this place needs? Better lighting, and maybe a deck. While Zara was probably building a lean-to and Brick was punching rocks into submission, I was designing what my dad would call a proper foundation. The hot springs were perfectly positioned for both defensive purposes and recreational amenities. The coral trees could be harvested sustainably for building materials without damaging the ecosystem. And that glowing river? Prime real estate with a view. By the end of day 3, I had a plan that went way beyond, don't die horribly for 30 days. I was going to build something that would make this death world wish it had been more hospitable to begin with. The first rule of construction is always start with a solid foundation. The second rule is that if you're not having at least a little fun with the project, you're doing it wrong. I was about to have a lot of fun. Day 4 was when I stopped pretending this was a survival situation and started treating it like what it really was, the galaxy's most expensive home renovation project. I began with the foundation because Dad always said if you're going to build something, build it right the first time. The natural hot spring sat in a perfect basin surrounded by those coral trees, with the glowing river providing both ambiance and a reliable water source. The whole setup screamed luxury resort so loudly that I was surprised the Academy hadn't just built a hotel here and charged admission. The coral trees were the key to everything. After some careful experimentation, which involved not getting dissolved by their defensive secretions, I figured out they were basically nature's version of self-assembling construction materials. Cut them right, and they'd naturally fuse with other pieces. Cut them wrong, and they'd try to digest you. It was like working with IKEA furniture, except the assembly instructions were written in chemical burns. By day 6, I had the basic structure up. Not a shelter, mind you, a pavilion. With proper drainage, wind-resistant joints, and what any reasonable person would call architectural flourishes. The hot springs got a stone border made from heat-resistant rocks I'd found near the Knot Mountains. The whole thing looked less like desperate survival attempt and more like boutique wilderness retreat. The water filtration system came next. The river's bioluminescent organisms were actually incredibly efficient at breaking down contaminants, so I built a series of collection pools that let them do their thing while keeping the water clean enough to drink. As a bonus, the filtered water still glowed faintly, which gave the whole place an otherworldly ambiance that you couldn't buy at any Earth resort. Food was almost insultingly easy. The local ecosystem had apparently evolved on the principle that everything should be both beautiful and delicious, probably as a trap for unwary tourists. Half the plants were basically alien fruit salad, and the other half tasted like someone had crossbred earth vegetables with whatever angels eat for breakfast. I set up a cultivation area and started what could generously be called agriculture, though it was more like politely asking very cooperative plants to grow faster. By day 8, I could hear that my fellow students weren't doing quite as well. Brick's roaring had taken on a distinctly frustrated quality, like someone trying to intimidate a crossword puzzle. Zara's sonar distress calls were coming at regular intervals, which suggested she'd at least established some kind of routine, probably involving panic at scheduled times between bouts of terror. Day 10 was when I added what Mom would call creature comforts, and what the Academy would probably classify as gross violations of the survival examination spirit. I'm talking about furniture carved from coral tree wood, a dining area with an actual table, and yes, a functional hot tub carved into the natural rock formation around the hot springs. The hot tub wasn't just luxury, it was engineering. The natural minerals in the springs had therapeutic properties that helped with everything from muscle recovery to immune system boosting. Any survival expert worth their salt would recognize the medical benefits. The fact that it also came with a view of the glowing river and comfortable seating for up to 8 people was just good planning. Day 12 brought the first real test of my construction skills. Keth 7's weather patterns included what the briefing materials had politely called atmospheric disturbances, which turned out to be storms that looked like someone had weaponized the concept of precipitation. Lightning that came in colors that didn't exist on Earth, rain that fell upward for the first 5 minutes, and wind that changed directions according to no pattern that anyone with a functioning brain would call logical. My pavilion held up perfectly. The coral tree construction flexed with the wind instead of fighting it. The drainage system handled the upside-down rain without flooding, and the whole structure actually seemed to get stronger after the storm passed. Meanwhile, I could hear the sounds of other student shelters being redesigned by hurricane-force winds and creative weather phenomena. By day 15, I had to admit I'd gotten a little carried away. The basic survival requirements were met so thoroughly that I was starting to get bored. The food garden was producing more than I could eat. The water system was so efficient I was considering bottling the excess. The shelter had enough space for a small conference. That's when I made 2 important realizations. First, the Academy was definitely monitoring us somehow, because there was no way they'd risk losing students without some kind of oversight. Second, if they were monitoring us, they were probably watching me turn their ultimate survival challenge into what looked suspiciously like a vacation rental property. I started adding finishing touches. A small observatory platform for watching Keth 7's twin moons rise over the Knot Mountains, a meditation garden where the bioluminescent plants created natural mood lighting, a workshop area where I could craft tools and furniture from local materials. The whole thing was starting to look less like a survival camp and more like the kind of place that would charge 500 credits a night and have a waiting list 3 months long. Which gave me an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. Probably both. Time to see if the Academy's communication blackout was as thorough as they claimed. Day 16 was when I discovered that the Academy's impenetrable communication blackout had about as much integrity as their student safety protocols. The emergency beacon in my survival kit wasn't just for life-threatening situations, it turned out. It was also broadcasting a low-level telemetry signal that included location data, basic vital signs, and environmental readings, standard practice for any organization that wanted to avoid explaining to parents why their kids had been turned into alien plant food. More importantly, it was broadcasting on a frequency that I could tap into with some creative rewiring and a few components salvaged from the landing pod. By day 17, I had established what could charitably be called galactic internet access, and what the Academy would probably call a flagrant violation of examination protocols. The signal was weak, but it was enough to send messages. And if you can send messages, you can send advertisements. I spent day 18 crafting the perfect marketing copy. Tired of the same old vacation destinations? Bored with safe, sanitized resort experiences? Come to Keth 7, where adventure meets luxury in the galaxy's most exclusive wilderness retreat. Morrison's Death World Resort offers authentic survival thrills with 5-star amenities, hot spring spa treatments, gourmet alien cuisine, guided tours of hostile terrain, all in a setting so dangerous that most governments classify it as a weapons testing ground. Book now for the adventure of several lifetimes. Assuming you survive to tell about it. I added some pictures I'd taken with the pod's emergency documentation camera, did a little light photo editing to emphasize the dramatic lighting and exotic scenery, and sent the whole package out on every tourism frequency I could reach. Then I went back to work on what was rapidly becoming less of a survival shelter and more of a destination resort. Day 19 brought my first customer inquiry. Apparently, wealthy Centaurians were very interested in authentic Death World experiences and had money to burn on extreme tourism. Who knew that having more credits than cents was a universal constant? Day 20 was when I got my first booking confirmation. A party of 4 from the Rigel system, willing to pay premium rates for what they called the ultimate adrenaline vacation. They were scheduled to arrive in 3 days via private shuttle, and they expected full-service accommodations with guided wilderness experiences. I had 72 hours to transform my survival project into a functioning luxury resort. Challenge accepted. Day 21 was a masterclass in crisis management and rapid deployment construction. I expanded the dining pavilion, added private quarters for guests, and installed what could generously be called a concierge station, but was really just a desk made from polished coral tea wood with a sign that said management. The real stroke of genius came when I realized I could hear Zara's distress calls getting closer. She was moving in my direction, probably following the river toward higher ground. Brick's frustrated roaring suggested he was also converging on the area, likely for the same reason. Perfect. Every resort needs staff. Day 22 was when I made first contact with my fellow survivors. Zara stumbled into my resort complex, looking like she'd been through a blender set to hostile ecosystem, took one look at my hot tub and dining pavilion, and immediately started hyperventilating through her gills. "Morrison," she gasped, "what in the 7 hells of Aquatica is all this?" "Survival," I said, gesturing at the whole setup with what I hoped was convincing sincerity. You know, making the best of a bad situation, basic wilderness adaptation. Brick arrived an hour later, took one look at the place, and rumbled something that sounded like confused anger mixed with grudging admiration. "This is not survival," he growled, his rocky exterior shifting colors in what I'd learned was his species' equivalent of being flustered. This is hospitality," I finished. "And speaking of which, you two look like you could use a meal and a soak in the hot springs. Consider yourselves my guests." It took about 30 seconds of experiencing actual comfort for them to agree to what I tactfully called temporary employment opportunities in the hospitality sector. Zara turned out to have excellent organizational skills when she wasn't panicking, and Brick was surprisingly good at guided tours once he stopped trying to intimidate the landscape into submission. Day 23 was opening day. The Rigel party arrived in a shuttle that probably cost more than most planets' annual defense budgets, took one look at Morrison's Death World Resort, and immediately started taking pictures for their social media feeds. "This is incredible," gushed their leader, a humanoid with more money than survival instincts. "It's so authentically dangerous, yet so refined. How do you maintain such standards in such a hostile environment?" "Trade secrets," I replied, while mentally calculating how much I could charge for behind-the-scenes resort management tours. The next 48 hours were a blur of guided wilderness expeditions, gourmet dining experiences featuring local cuisine, and luxury accommodations that happened to be located on one of the galaxy's most notorious death worlds. My guests loved every minute of it. They paid premium rates for the privilege of being terrified in comfort, and they tipped generously for services rendered. By day 25, I had a waiting list. Word was spreading through the galaxy's elite tourism networks about this exclusive resort that offered authentic survival experiences without any of the actual risk of death. The booking requests were coming in faster than I could process them, and several major tourism corporations were making enquiries about franchise opportunities. Zara had evolved from panicked student to efficient resort manager, handling reservations and customer service with the kind of attention to detail that comes from spending weeks in mortal terror, and then discovering that hot meals and comfortable beds are actually quite nice. Brick had found his calling as a tour guide, leading expeditions to scenic overlooks and dangerous wildlife viewing areas, while maintaining a running commentary about the various ways the local ecosystem could theoretically kill you, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had personally argued with most of it. The whole operation was running so smoothly that I almost forgot we were supposed to be taking a survival examination. That's when Professor Vextal's shuttle appeared on the horizon, and I realized that my little entrepreneurial experiment was about to get a whole lot more complicated. Day 26 started with what I like to call the morning I became the galaxy's most controversial student. Professor Vextal's shuttle landed with all the subtlety of a diplomatic incident, which, as it turned out, was exactly what this was about to become. He emerged from the craft looking like someone had personally insulted his entire academic lineage, his compound eyes scanning my resort complex with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or government efficiency reports. "Morrison," he clicked, his mandibles working overtime to process what he was seeing. "What exactly is this?" I gestured at the bustling resort around us, where my current guests were enjoying a leisurely breakfast while planning their afternoon predator-watching expedition. This is survival, Professor. 30 days of not dying, as requested. This is a hospitality establishment, he said, his voice reaching frequencies that probably qualified as a sonic weapon in 17 different star systems. You have paying customers, you have staff, you have what appears to be a functioning gift shop. The gift shop was Zara's idea, actually. Turns out tourists love authentic Death World souvenirs. Who knew? Vextal's exoskeleton was making small creaking noises that suggested either deep philosophical contemplation or an impending molt. "You were supposed to survive alone, Mr. Morrison. The examination explicitly required isolation and self-reliance." And I survived. Alone. For the first 15 days anyway. After that I adapted to changing circumstances and demonstrated advanced resource management skills. Isn't that what survival is really about? Survival, Vextal said with the patience of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly dense asteroid, is about enduring hardship with minimal resources, not about creating a luxury resort and charging admission. That's when Director Quinn showed up, because apparently my little business venture had attracted attention from the Academy's administration. Quinn was one of those bureaucratic species that looked like someone had crossed an accountant with a very nervous squid, and his arrival meant that paperwork and regulations were about to become weaponized. "Professor Vextal?" Quinn burbled, his tentacles writhing in what I'd learned was their equivalent of pulling out a calculator. "We have a problem. The Galactic Tourism Board is demanding answers about unauthorized commercial operations in Academy examination zones. The Ministry of Educational Standards is asking questions about student safety protocols. And someone from the Interspecies Business Ethics Commission wants to know if we're going to charge Mr. Morrison taxes on his revenue." "Revenue?" Vextal's voice cracked slightly. "How much revenue?" I pulled out my makeshift ledger, which Zara had organized with frightening efficiency. "Well, let's see. Accommodation fees, dining charges, guided tour premiums, spa services, gift shop sales, and expedition insurance. We're looking at roughly 47,000 credits over the past 9 days. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens right before civilizations collapse or new laws get written. 47,000 credits, Quinn repeated slowly, as if saying it again might make the number make more sense. In 9 days, on a death world, during a survival examination. Market rates are pretty competitive for authentic extreme tourism, I explained. Plus, we're the only game in the sector, so we can charge premium prices for exclusivity. Director Quinn's tentacles were now moving in patterns that suggested either advanced mathematical calculations or a complete nervous breakdown. The legal implications alone. Are you licensed for interspecies hospitality? Do you have environmental impact permits? Have you filed the appropriate xenobiology safety disclosures? I've been a little busy not dying to worry about paperwork, I said, but I'm sure we can sort all that out after the examination period ends. That's when the media shuttle arrived. Apparently word had gotten out through the tourism networks about the human student, who'd turned a survival examination into a business opportunity. Galactic News Network, several travel bloggers, and what looked like a documentary crew were all suddenly very interested in getting the story about Morrison's Death World resort. This is a disaster, Vextal muttered, watching reporters set up equipment while my current guests posed for pictures next to the hot springs. An absolute academic disaster. Actually, said a voice from behind us, this is the most interesting thing to happen in survival education in 3 centuries. We turned to see Dean Helix, the Academy's chief administrator, emerging from yet another shuttle. Helix was one of those ancient crystalline beings who thought in geological timescales and spoke in measured, precise sentences that carried the weight of institutional authority. Dean Helix, Vextal said, his relief evident. Please tell me you're here to shut this down and restore proper examination protocols. I'm here, Helix replied, her voice resonating like wind chimes made of pure authority, to determine whether Mr. Morrison has redefined survival education or simply exposed the fundamental flaws in our current testing methodology. Day 27 brought what I like to call the great academic philosophical crisis of the modern era. Media coverage was spreading across the galaxy faster than a bureaucratic memo, and suddenly everyone had opinions about whether building a successful business qualified as survival. The debate was getting heated. Traditional survivalists argued that I'd cheated by using resources beyond the basic kit. Progressive educators claimed I'd demonstrated advanced adaptation and resource utilization skills. Economists were fascinated by the profit margins. Tourism boards wanted to know if they could franchise the concept. Day 28 was when the lawyers arrived. Apparently, when you accidentally create a successful business on a planet that 17 different governments classify as too dangerous for settlement, the legal implications get complicated fast. There were questions about territorial jurisdiction, business licensing, environmental regulations, student visa restrictions, and something called unauthorized death world commercialization. That was apparently a real legal category. Day 29 was supposed to be my last day of examination, but by then the whole situation had spiraled into something that would probably require its own government commission to sort out. The Academy was facing pressure from multiple directions. The tourism industry was demanding access to previously restricted death worlds, and several other educational institutions were asking if they needed to revise their own survival curricula. Meanwhile, I was still running a resort. My guests were still having the time of their lives, my staff was still efficiently managing operations, and my booking requests were still coming in faster than I could process them. All I'd done was refuse to accept that survival meant barely scraping by. Apparently that was enough to accidentally trigger a galaxy-wide educational and economic crisis. Tomorrow was graduation day, and I still had no idea if I was going to pass, fail, get arrested, or accidentally become the most successful student in Academy history. Possibly all 4. Day 30 arrived with all the fanfare of a galactic summit, which, considering the media coverage and number of government officials who'd shown up, it basically was. Teen Helix had called what she diplomatically termed a public examination review, which was academic speak for, we have no idea what to do with this situation, so we're going to make a big show of figuring it out. The entire clearing around my resort had been transformed into an impromptu amphitheater, with representatives from the Academy, various government agencies, tourism boards, media outlets, and what appeared to be half the galaxy's educational establishment. Professor Vextal stood at a podium that someone had hastily constructed from local materials, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the known universe. In his claws he held what I assumed was my final examination results, though given the circumstances it was probably more like a legal document that would require 3 different courts to interpret. Ladies, gentlemen, and entities of various classifications, Vextal began, his voice carrying across the crowd with the authority of someone who'd rather be grading normal papers about normal survival techniques. We are here to determine the final examination results for Mr. Jake Morrison, human, of Earth. The crowd went quiet, except for the soft humming of recording equipment and what sounded like several beings taking bets on the outcome. Mr. Morrison was tasked with surviving 30 days on Keth 7, a Class 5 hostile environment with minimal equipment and no outside assistance. Vextal paused, his compound eyes scanning the resort complex that had grown up around us. The question before us is whether what he accomplished constitutes survival, entrepreneurship, educational innovation, or flagrant disregard for examination protocols. I raised my hand from where I was standing next to my concierge desk. For what it's worth, Professor, I did survive. 30 days, hostile environment, no outside assistance for the first 15 days. Everything after that was just good planning. Dean Helix stepped forward, her crystalline form catching the light from Keth 7's twin suns in ways that probably qualified as a natural phenomenon. Mr. Morrison, in your opinion, what is the primary objective of survival? Not dying, I said immediately. Everything else is just quality of life improvements. And do you believe you achieved that objective? I gestured at the thriving resort around us, where my current guests were enjoying their final morning of authentic Death World hospitality while my staff efficiently managed checkout procedures. Well, I'm not dead. Neither is anyone else who came here during the examination period. In fact, everyone seems to have had a pretty good time not dying. So, yeah, I'd say objective achieved. The examination, Professor Vextal interjected, with the persistence of someone fighting a losing battle against common sense, specifically required individual survival techniques, not hospitality management. Actually, said a new voice from the crowd, it didn't. Everyone turned to see a small, elderly creature that looked like someone had crossed a librarian with a very studious turtle. This was Archivist Slow, the Academy's official keeper of rules and regulations, and if she said something wasn't in the rules, then it wasn't in the rules. I have reviewed the examination guidelines extensively, Archivist Slow continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd actually read every line of the fine print. The requirement was to survive 30 days on a hostile world with minimal equipment. No specific restrictions on methodology, resource utilization, or interaction with other life forms were included in the official protocols. The silence that followed was the sound of an entire educational establishment realizing they'd been outsmarted by their own paperwork. Dean Helix's crystalline form seemed to brighten slightly, which I'd learned was her species equivalent of a smile. Furthermore, Mr. Morrison's approach demonstrates several advanced survival principles that are rarely seen in examination settings. Resource maximization, environmental adaptation, social organization, economic sustainability, and what our xenopsychology department calls aggressive problem-solving optimization. In other words, I said helpfully, I didn't just survive. I thrived, and I helped other people thrive too. Isn't that what survival is supposed to be about? Professor Vextal looked at his examination results, looked at my resort, looked at the crowd of media representatives and government officials, and made what was probably the most difficult decision of his academic career. Jake Morrison, he announced, his voice carrying across the clearing with the finality of judicial pronouncement. You have not only passed your survival examination, you have achieved the highest grade in Academy history, and you have also created what appears to be a legitimate business that will require approximately 47 different regulatory agencies to properly classify. The crowd erupted into what could charitably be called controlled chaos, and what I would describe as the sound of bureaucrats realizing they had a lot more paperwork to do. Dean Helix raised one crystalline appendage for silence. Mr. Morrison, the Academy would like to offer you a position as an instructor in our newly created Department of Applied Survival Innovation. Your techniques will be studied, your methods will be documented, and your approach will revolutionize how we think about hostile environment adaptation. That's very flattering, I said, but I've got a business to run. Speaking of which, we're booking reservations for next season, and I'm thinking about expanding to include some of the other death worlds in this sector. Anyone interested in investing in the galaxy's first chain of extreme tourism resorts? 6 months later, Morrison's Death World destinations had locations on 12 different hostile planets, employed over 300 beings from 47 different species, and held the safety record for the most dangerous vacation destinations in known space. Professor Vextal eventually wrote a textbook about my examination experience. It became required reading at survival schools across the galaxy, though he still insisted on calling what I did an unprecedented deviation from standard protocols, rather than good business sense. Zara became my operations manager, and eventually opened her own resort chain, specializing in aquatic death worlds. Brick started a wilderness guide training program and discovered he had a talent for teaching other species how to argue with hostile environments. And me? I learned that sometimes the best way to survive is to stop thinking about survival and start thinking about what comes next. Though I still think 47 regulatory agencies is probably overkill for a simple hospitality business, even if it is located on planets that are actively trying to kill everyone.